All right, so thank you all who are hopping on our webinar today. We are thrilled to have you. We'd like to welcome you to our data release event for Exposing Connecticut's Eviction Crisis, Understanding the Intersection of Race and Sex on Housing Instability in Connecticut. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jenny Stedman, Executive Director of the Aurora Women and Girls Foundation. And we were proud to fund the work of our partners at Connecticut Data Collaborative and the Connecticut Fair Housing Center to provide groundbreaking information on the disproportionate impact of evictions on communities of color. An analysis of residential eviction court filings in Connecticut, undertaken to better understand the state's crisis, reveals how decades of discriminatory housing policies and actions continue to disproportionately harm women and Black and Hispanic residents. To give everyone a roadmap for today's presentation, I will begin with some background on the development of this project. Then Fanula Darby-Hudgens, Director of Operations, Connecticut Fair Housing Center, will provide background on Connecticut's legacy of discriminatory housing and land use policy and how that built and maintains the conditions for Connecticut's current eviction crisis. Michelle Reardon-Nold, Connecticut Data Collaborative's Executive Director, will then present the findings of the report. And finally, Melissa Marichal, Staff Attorney at the Connecticut Fair Housing Center, will discuss the status of Connecticut's remaining emergency eviction protections and ongoing efforts today to create fair systems for renting families, including implementation of the state's historic Right to Counsel program for tenants facing eviction. We will save time for questions and answers at the end. Please post your questions in the chat. Next slide, please, Marie. Aurora invests in cutting-edge research on women and girls to build effective solutions to the inequity that denies women and girls, and particularly women and girls of color, the opportunities and supports that would allow them to thrive. Today's project grows out of our long-term research efforts. Specifically, today's project expands upon the insights on pandemic housing needs illuminated in Essential Equity, Women, COVID-19, and Rebuilding Connecticut, that was published in January 2021, which was the result of an amazing collaborative effort by women's funds across the state, women and girls serving organizations in the Connecticut Collective for Women and Girls, state agencies, and many others. This report led the nation in providing real-time data on the impact of the pandemic with an intersectional gender and racial equity framework. What was the motivation behind Essential Equity? As advocates for women and girls, we knew that systems of sexism and racism already disadvantaged women and girls, and we braced ourselves for how the COVID-19 economic and health crisis would further harm them. This report documents that harm. Essential Equity shows the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on women, and particularly women of color, across areas of health, economic security, childcare, housing, mental health, safety, and hunger. Next slide, please. Of particular note were the report's insights on how housing inequities were worsened by the pandemic. Essential Equity found that 19% of females felt no confidence in their ability to pay their rent or mortgage the following month. 20% of Black females were estimated to be behind on their rent or mortgage. Despite the eviction moratorium since the start of the pandemic, we found that landlords had filed over 2,500 new eviction cases. The Exposing Connecticut's Eviction Crisis Research Partnership has allowed us to further explore these troubling findings and offer more evidence for legislators and community leaders about the extreme nature of the eviction crisis and how it disproportionately impacts women of color in Connecticut. Next slide, please. And finally, we'd like to also make sure that our audience today is aware of additional research available on Connecticut's women and girls. Working with the fabulous Connecticut Data Collaborative, in December of 2019, we launched the Women and Girls Data Platform, an online interactive tool that makes information on the status of women and girls available in just a few clicks. Now, anyone can access data broken down by race and gender, and also by state, county, and city. And not to harp on the leading the nation thing, but we're the only state in the country that has this kind of resource. We would like to thank the William and Alice Mortensen Foundation for their support of Aurora's research efforts. And thank you to my colleague, Marie McNamara, who is providing technical wizardry this morning. And now I'll turn the presentation over to Fanula Darby-Hudgens for insight on how we've reached this crisis point through decades of failed housing policy.
Good morning. Jenny, thank you so much for that warm welcome. And Marie, if you don't mind just clicking the slide forward, that would be super helpful. So a quick thank you to the Aurora Foundation for Women and Girls, for the National Low Income Housing Council. And I cannot help but to say how grateful and excited I am to be collaborating with Connecticut Data Collaborative. I've been a longtime consumer of their work, so to partner with them feels just like another milestone for us. The Fair Housing Center is a private civil rights nonprofit organization that works to ensure all people have access to the housing of their choice that is free from discrimination. We do this work in 4 distinct ways. The first, and demonstrated here, is we do a fair amount of know your rights education and outreach. We engage in a significant amount of policy advocacy that my colleague, attorney Mari Chal, will explain later in the presentation. We also do litigation work by enforcing the Fair Housing Act, and we engage in foreclosure prevention. Next slide, please. And so you may be wondering why a fair housing organization is here speaking about eviction. And it is my role today to explain how decades of persistent discriminatory housing policy have contributed not only to an eviction crisis, but specifically how the disparities in eviction filings fall along sex and race lines. The Fair Housing Act was passed just 7 days after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., and it was drafted to do 2 distinct things. The first is to make discrimination illegal across all housing transactions. For example, the Fair Housing Act makes it illegal for a landlord to suggest they won't rent to you based on your race or ethnicity. It also makes it illegal for a bank to not lend to you because of your sex. The second part of the Fair Housing Act is intended to ensure that all jurisdictions enact policies that will promote integration. Over the past 53 years, as a nation, we have done an okay job at the first part of the Fair Housing Act. Organizations like the Connecticut Fair Housing Center represent victims of discrimination and seek damages for their discrimination. But we as a nation, and especially as a state in Connecticut, have not done as well with the intentions of the second half of the Fair Housing Act. Next slide, please. And so to understand the disparities in eviction filings, it is really important to get a sense of who lives in Connecticut and where they live in Connecticut. And so you'll see here on this slide that Connecticut as a state is actually increasing in racial diversity. When we look at data points from 2010 and then compare them to 2019, we see that populations that identify as Hispanic have increased over those 10 years. And folks who identify as white, not Hispanic, have in fact decreased across the state. Next slide, please. However, my colleagues and myself at the Fair Housing Center have recently completed the analysis of impediments to fair housing, which does things like measure segregation across the state. And we use a number of different statistical analyses to measure segregation. And one of the ways we do that is using dissimilarity indices and also diversity indexes. But this is actually a very clear way to see just how segregated Connecticut is. And so if you look at this map, you'll see the darker colors indicate where the highest percentage of non-white residents live by census tract. And when we look at this data on a statewide level, 37.2% of all of Connecticut's Black, Indigenous, and people of color live in Bridgeport, Hartford, New Haven, and Waterbury. That is indicating that 88% of Black and African American people live in just 27 of Connecticut's municipalities. Next slide, please. And so we also see this phenomena continue right down to the town boundary level with patterns of hypersegregation. And why this is so incredibly important, because another phenomena that has emerged from our analysis that we have come to realize is that people in Connecticut and people of color in Connecticut rent their homes 2-to-1 when compared to white families. So we're really seeing differences on where people of color have lived and what type of housing they live in. Next slide, please. Slide, please. And patterns of racial segregation are not created in isolation. In a report written by the Brookings Institute, they classified Connecticut as having one of the most exclusionary zoning laws in the country. In Connecticut, 25 municipalities did not permit any type of multifamily housing, really restricting where folks who are bound to rental housing are able to live. The report also suggested that 91% of the state's land is zoned for single family homes. Next slide, please. And so as a result of exclusionary land use policies, we see that income and wealth falls deeply along racial lines and deeply impacts when Black and Indigenous and other people of color are able to afford to live in Connecticut. And this phenomena is deeply entrenched in how we planned and how we enacted housing and land use policies over the past 100 years. Next slide, please. And so I'm going to take a few minutes here to set this up because I do think it is incredibly important for us to understand that the findings Michelle is going to be explaining to you after I am done talking here are truly not created in isolation, and that eviction is not a phenomena that sits on its own. So most Eastern Seaboard cities and most of the nation was developed strong. Housing was highly developed in the Industrial Revolution, and it was predominantly developed by private factories. And they were one of the first champions of affordable housing close to where we work, and they built workforce housing. Despite the fact that they recruited from places like Puerto Rico, they excluded non-white workers from access to this affordable housing. Then throughout the 30s, as we approach the Great Depression, the federal government decides that they have to interact for the first time within the housing market to save all of the development of the Industrial Revolution from foreclosure as a result of the Great Depression. This resulted in the federal government creating the Fair Housing Administration, which was charged with keeping homes from foreclosure. The way that they did this was they underwrote mortgages to protect homes from foreclosure, and they had to assess the risk of those mortgages. And the way they assessed the risk was by grading the neighborhoods of where the homes were located. They did not grade the neighborhoods based on the quality of the housing stock, the infrastructure, or the access to employment. They graded the neighborhoods on who lived there. Neighborhoods were downgraded based on the presence of Black and African American families and Jewish families. We are now seeing 30 years of continuation where we're seeing people of color denied housing opportunities or denied the access to recovery from Great Depression, not unlike we've seen some of the access of recovery funds denied from COVID-19. This pattern of discriminatory exclusion continues through the post-World War II era when we see GI benefits that for the first time really subsidized home ownership for even higher low-income families and low moderate income families, and those benefits were denied to soldiers of color returning from World War II. This phenomena continues after we spent a decade building up our suburbs for white families by providing highways and infrastructure and schools and plumbing and sewer. We then had to contend with a national call for increased highway development. And when it came time where we were going to put those highways, decisions were made in local, state, and federal land use offices to place those highways in neighborhoods that had been disinvested in the last 60 years. Highway development and urban renewal decimated non-white urban neighborhoods across the country, but most prolifically along the Northeast. And in Connecticut alone, especially in the greater Hartford area, thousands of non-white families were displaced from their homes as a result of highway development. For those of you who are familiar with the greater Hartford area, we really see this phenomena with the construction of 91 and 84. This idea of continued disinvestment in the spaces where people of color live and increased investment in the spaces where white people live continues today, even in how we are building current units of housing. Oftentimes, new development is designed for urban professionals without families with very high market rents, making it exclusionary housing just by the nature of the cost of it and who is able to live there. So that is all just to explain how the eviction data and the eviction filing data that Michelle is going to present sits in a deep legacy of discriminatory housing policy, and that the phenomena presented today were not created in isolation. Thank you so much, and I'm going to pass this along to my colleague, Michelle.
Okay, thank you so much, Finn, for setting the stage for what I'm about to present. I'd also like to thank my staff, Jason and Ilya in particular, who did all the work to make this presentation possible. So why are we referring to this as groundbreaking? It's the first time evictions have been analyzed, geocoded, and made public in this state. Second, we enhanced the public record to fill in gaps in the data that allow us for the first time to say who is being evicted. So the first gap is that we assign male-female probabilities by matching names to historical baby names for the past 50 years, looking at the Social Security administrative records. In addition, to determine race ethnicity, we use Sergio's implementation of the Bayesian improved surname geocoding model, and more information on these methodologies can be found on our eviction map website. Finally, we geocoded the filings data and made it publicly available. So a little bit about eviction filings. Not all eviction cases result in the tenant moving, but the filing of an eviction case can have permanent consequences regardless of the outcome of the case. And often the existence of an eviction case record alone leads to a renter's applications being denied. So with that, let's get into the data. So between 2017 and 2021, which is the years we analyzed eviction cases for, there were 75,429 eviction cases that were filed. And so although there was a moratorium, and when you hear the word moratorium, you think that 0 evictions were filed. In fact, there were still eviction cases being filed during the moratorium. And in recent months, the number of eviction cases filed by landlords has approached pre-pandemic levels. For example, in Hartford, eviction filings have already surpassed pre-pandemic levels. Next slide. So who is being evicted? Next slide. Across all 5 years that we looked at, Black renters have cases filed against them at the highest rates. Black renters were over 3 times more likely than white tenants to face eviction, and Hispanic and Latino renters are 2 times more likely than white renters to face evictions. Next. When we looked at the data by male-female renter, majority of eviction cases were filed against female renters, and this is true across all years of the data. Next. Further, when looking at the intersection of race, ethnicity, and sex, 62% of eviction filings were against Black female renters, and 59% of eviction filings were against Hispanic, Latino female renters. So who is filing the evictions? For this analysis, we looked at both public housing authorities and private landlords. Next. From 2017 to 2019, there were about 3,000 eviction cases brought by public housing authorities. The top 5 are shown in the chart, and more than 60% of the filings were against Black and Hispanic Latino renters. As Finn presented, it is not surprising given the history of exclusionary zoning of rental housing in Connecticut that our largest cities had the highest numbers of eviction filings in the state. Hartford had the most with over 10,000 eviction filings, followed by Bridgeport, Waterbury, and New Haven. Next. With the assistance of Melissa and Solomon at the CT Fair Housing Center, we also looked at different types of eviction filings, and we discovered that the number of no-cause evictions more than doubled in 2021 by private landlords when compared to pre-pandemic filings, which was a startling finding, since as I mentioned at the beginning, the mere filing of an eviction case can have permanent consequences, regardless of the outcome of the case. So who has representation and what are the outcomes? You can see we found that 80% of landlords had access to counsel, and that was true for all years, while 7% of renters had access to counsel. And what that means is it means that landlords are 11 times more likely to have representation. What's interesting is that even though fewer eviction filings occurred during the moratorium, the percentage of renters that had access to counsel did not increase. So that 7% stayed constant throughout the pandemic. Next, we also found disparities in access to counsel. So white renters were 37% more likely than Black renters to have counsel. White renters were also 30% more likely than Hispanic Latino renters to have counsel. And male renters were 7% more likely than female renters to have counsel. What does this all mean? Further, the consequences are quite different without counsel. We found that renters are 89% more likely to have removal orders issued against them if they did not have legal representation. Another stark finding is that renters with lawyers were more than twice as likely to have their cases withdrawn and 43% more likely to have them dismissed. So access to counsel really does impact the outcomes of cases. What I shared were some of the major findings from our analysis, but I encourage all of you to read the report on the link that's shown above. In addition, we have also made all the data available to the public in an interactive map as shown by the screenshot on the slide. There's more research to be done, including more in-depth exploration of who is filing evictions and a better understanding of the outcomes and access to counsel. However, I encourage all of you to explore the data to get an understanding of the impact it's having across our state. The map does provide data at the town level, zip code level, and census tract, and across all 5 years, updated really in a real-time basis. Encourage all of you, it's downloadable. We also share our methodology and would love to hear from the academics who are on the call to get feedback on the methodologies we applied. So now I'll turn it over to Melissa, who will talk about her work in supporting tenants.
Hi, good morning. Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Melissa Child, and I'm a staff attorney at the Connecticut Fair Housing Center. Thank you, Michelle, for presenting some of those key findings from the report. We're all at the Fair Housing Center really excited about this groundbreaking data and what it can show us about how evictions are impacting our communities in Connecticut. And as Michelle has covered very briefly, and I encourage you to dig into the data and to the report on your own, but it shows generally that our eviction crisis here in Connecticut was not created by the COVID-19 pandemic, but rather has plagued Connecticut renters for many years. It's also provided us with the data to measure the volume of residential eviction cases, the racial and ethnic disparities, the disproportionate harm faced by women and women of color in particular, and the imbalance of access to legal representation between landlords and tenants. And as a tenant attorney representing families in housing court, these injustices are nothing new. These are patterns that we see in housing court on a regular basis, but we have not had the data to measure these injustices and to provide us with the evidence that we need to understand what we can do differently to make an impact and intervene in this cycle. So with that in mind, I am closing us out with just some thoughts on how we can look forward, what we can do to intervene, to make an impact, knowing that evictions are impacting so many families in Connecticut and are impacting Black and Latino families at a disparate pace here. So there's of course many different possible interventions. And before I go into one short-term intervention that you can get involved in today, actually. And I'll also discuss one longer one that you can also get involved in. I just want to say that I think one of the key elements of all of the work going forward is education, awareness, participation of tenants and impacted families. Lived experiences are extremely important to this work. We only can know so much from the data. We can only go so far with that evidence. We need to build a movement for housing justice that is broad and that includes the voices of the many families that are impacted by evictions and by poor housing conditions in the rental market. And so I'm really excited about how we can use this data to start talking about eviction more openly, to work and build together a housing justice movement for everyone here. So in terms of immediate impacts, as Michelle mentioned, we have had a number of eviction protections instituted in the state of Connecticut. There were two types of moratoriums that were put in place initially at the start of the pandemic that expired last summer. One of those, in place of those protections, in place of the state protection, Governor Lamont issued Emergency Order 12D. Emergency Order 12D is not an eviction moratorium, but it provides some eviction protections that work in conjunction with the state's emergency rental assistance program called Unite CT to prevent evictions during the pandemic and to make it to allow for tenants to have more time, tenants and landlords to have more time to get their applications processed before an eviction case can be filed, which is very important in terms of reducing the possibility of a eviction record being created for the members of that household, and also making it giving tenants more time for that application to be processed before a martial order from the court called the execution can actually issue and be used to force a household to leave their home. So I have up on the screen a few key components of that order. And the reason why we're talking about that today is because it's set to expire on next Tuesday, February 15th. Next slide. So as I said, the executive order 12D was instituted to work in conjunction with our emergency rental assistance program. So to ensure that this money is going to actually prevent tenants from being displaced, from being unstably housed. So it works in conjunction, and without the protections that the executive order provide, there's nothing stopping landlords from continuing to pursue evictions and getting those final move-out orders from the courts while a rental assistance application is being processed. And those applications do take quite a bit of time to be processed. So right now, the program actually has over $190 million that is still holding on to and has not paid out to landlords yet. Those dollars are committed to applications that are currently being processed, but have not been processed to completion. And it's expected that it'll take several months, likely well into the summer, for all of those applications to be processed and for landlords to receive those payments. But under the rental assistance program right now, the program only requires a landlord to withdraw an eviction case once their application has been approved and they've received the payment. So Executive Order 12D is important in, again, making it possible to get that application processed and allowing the tenant to stay housed and complete that objective of the Unite CT program. Next slide. So as I mentioned, because the order is set to expire on the 15th, we have a very short window to make our voices heard and to explain to our legislature why we think it's important that they extend Executive Order 12D. It's in their hands. And actually, as we speak right now, there's currently a informational hearing being held by the Public Health Committee about extending a limited set of the governor's executive orders. So if you feel strongly like I do about the need to extend Executive Order 12D to prevent evictions and keep tenants stably housed, then you can, one, email testimony to the committee, and you can also call or email your the House and Senate Democratic leadership, as well as your local state senator and state representative. And I will throw this information as well into the chat so you can have it on hand. Just do that right now. Let's share that with everyone. Great. So I promised 2 possible interventions, one short, one long term. So that was my short intervention, short term, and the long term intervention that I wanted to speak to you all about today is tenants' right to counsel. So you might have heard that last June, Connecticut became the 3rd state to pass legislation that provides income eligible tenants facing eviction with the right to counsel. This has been a growing trend across the nation, and we're very excited for Connecticut to be the 3rd state to pass legislation that creates this right. And last week, the program got off the ground and is rolling out now to 14 of the highest evicting zip codes. So this means that in those zip codes, tenants have the right to legal representation in their cases. And I think Marie has put the program website in the chat, so you can check it out, learn more about who currently qualifies under the program, the history of how this came to be, and how you can seek legal assistance, whether you're in those qualifying zip codes currently or outside them, and can seek assistance from statewide legal services hotline. But because we know it's now more than ever with this eviction data report that counsel makes an immense difference in the outcomes for tenants, this is a really groundbreaking program that can reduce both forced moves of tenants, reduce overall eviction filings at an annual basis, which has been shown in many different jurisdictions that have created this program previously. And so we are excited about it. And what we need to fight for now is to make it a permanent and fully funded state program. So last year it passed with 2 years of federal funding, and that's enough to get it off the ground, but we passed the statewide right to counsel. And so we need permanent funding that will allow the program to hire and train enough attorneys to get us to statewide coverage of this program. So we are hosting a kickoff with the Connecticut Right to Counsel Coalition next week on the 15th, the day that the emergency eviction protection is set to expire, where we'll talk more about this, and you can learn how to get more involved in it. And so I'll leave it at that, and I'll drop the RSVP link in the chat too. But again, like I said, there's a number of different ways that we can work to address the eviction crisis together. These are just 2 of them, but I think it's important to keep both tools in mind. The immediate interventions that we can work on today, as we are in the pandemic, we're in the emergency, and there continue to be emergency funds available to assist families in need, and also to ensure that we don't leave this pandemic with the same broken system that we started with, and to ensure that we move forward with a more fair system that keeps more tenants housed in safe and healthy housing. So thank you. I will now pass it off to Jenny.
Thanks so much, Melissa. So thank you all for those of you who have been putting your questions in the chat. We've got several of them, and I'm gonna, in a minute, turn it over to Michelle to kind of actually show you how the report works and the very cool map works. But first, Finn, could you answer really quick what a no-cause eviction is? Because there was a couple of questions about that.
I can, but while Attorney Marichal is on the panel, I'm going to let her take that question.
Yeah, sure. I think I heard the question, but can you just repeat it one more time, Jenny?
Sure. We had people asking what was meant by the term no-cause eviction. Yes.
So there's a limited number of reasons a landlord can start an eviction case in Connecticut. Most of them are considered for-cause cases. So that's a case where a tenant has failed to pay their rent, or they've violated another term in their lease agreement, or they've violated a state law. Then there is what's considered no-cause evictions, which generally is the example that's most simple to understand, is if I'm a tenant, I have a lease agreement for a year, I'm not able to move out, but I haven't done anything wrong since the lease expired. I am continuing to pay my rent, I'm a good tenant, I haven't violated the lease, but my landlord did not want to extend the lease. And so in Connecticut, they have the right, because the lease has expired, to file an eviction to force me to leave. So that's why we call those no-cause evictions, where there's no violation or failure to pay rent. They simply want the tenant to leave because they no longer want to rent to them. Oftentimes those cases come up where a landlord might want to increase the rent, remodel the apartment, and we're seeing that a lot right now, possibly we suspect as also a way to avoid the current requirements that landlords have to apply for the Unite CT rental assistance program, which would require them to go through a number of steps and wait for that application to be processed. So these no-cause evictions can be a quite fast way that landlords are able to remove tenants from their homes. And it's quite concerning that the trend of using that tool is growing when families in those positions haven't actually violated the lease.
And we're about to turn it over to Michelle, but while we have you, Melissa, could you answer, there are a couple of questions about funding for right to counsel, and whether there is sufficient funding to expand beyond the current 14 zip codes. And I doubt that, but I will let you answer as the expert.
Yeah, so it's in flux right now because it just opened, and so they're still trying to assess the needs in the zip codes that they've opened up to. And they're also at the same time actively hiring with the funding that they do have and training staff to build up the program, because as Michelle noted, the number of tenant attorneys in the state previously was so low. 7% of tenants had representation. So a big key component right now is actually hiring staff to build out that program. So if you are an attorney or have an attorney friend, check out the postings at Greater Hartford Legal Aid, New Haven Legal Assistance, Connecticut Legal Services, and think about that. That's also a component. But so right now there is capacity potentially to open up to more zip codes, but it's a combination of figuring out what the demand is in these zip codes and how quickly attorneys can be hired. So if additional zip codes are added, they will be added, that information will be added to the Right to Counsel program website, which is evictionhelpct.org.
And just to add to what Melissa shared, also at evictionhelpct.org, you will soon see postings in addition for eviction specialists, just to address one of the comments made in the chat about hiring folks in addition to attorneys. And there will also be hiring opportunities specifically for translation services and for interpretation services for defendants who do not speak English. So there's a lot of hiring happening. So if you're interested in getting involved in the work, stay focused on those channels, and we can include those links when we send everything else out as well.
Yeah, and actually, Finn, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I don't want to do a disservice to mentioning that we also have fought hard for the implementation to be just. And that means that they're also hiring more interpreters, they're hiring support staff to make sure that this program, that it actually serves everyone in need and those most impacted. The findings of the report also showed that Black and Latino families are less likely to have legal representation than white families in Connecticut. So all those issues of access and making sure it's an equitable program as we implement it is really important.
We also have a specific question about, how can families get help who have a filed eviction, who are struggling to find new rental housing? And so we've been posting resources in the chat, but we'll be sending out a follow-up email to everybody who registered for this session, along with the recording, but also links to resources and other avenues for help for folks that are facing the eviction.
Thank you, Jenny. I just shared my screen to show everybody where they can access the data. Can you see the website?
Yep.
Great. All right, so this is the main page, ctdata.org/evictions. And from this page, you can read the report, which has more information than what I shared, and also explore the eviction map. So there was a question about household size, and we do go into that in the report. On average, it's about 2.4 adults in the household. The public record shares only provides adults in the household. So and it can be found towards the bottom of this report. I won't scroll to make you all dizzy, but so you can see eviction filings by household size. And then for the those interested in the map, you can, perhaps if my screenshot wasn't clear enough, but you can choose zip code, town, or census tract level, select the time period, and we've updated this through February 6th. And we'll be updating it probably on a monthly or bi-weekly basis. We haven't yet determined that. And then you can look at evictions filed versus renters facing eviction and download the data as well. I think that answers the questions that were specific about data, but if I missed anything, Jenny, just let me know.
Michelle, there was one about getting the data in CSV form and whether you could do it by both date and geography.
Yeah, so when you select, I believe you can. When you select, say you're interested in town level data, and you select it, it will then right here allow you to download what in particular you're looking at. So I don't know if those, you could see that as I changed what I was looking for, the values changed, and then the CSV changed as well.
Jason is letting us know that
you can't do that.
You can't do that.
Yes, yeah, I just got, yeah. No, I think part of that is due to protecting. We also wanted to make sure when we made the data available to the public that we protected people's privacy. So making it probably down to the town level would have then, you would run into small numbers and perhaps also revealing identities of those that are facing eviction filings.
Great. Do we have any additional, let's see. We have a question about like a big picture question that I'll say for the end about how this relates to what we're seeing nationally. But the data there's a question about, does the data include the racial and gender indicators as well?
So it does, yeah. So if you look at what I chose Wallingford and New Haven, and so you can see percent female, and if you hover over the I, it just we explain a little bit about the methodology, and here you can see the estimates for Asian Pacific, Black, Latino, multi-race, and white. And those who are interested in the methodology can go down here and click and read on the methodology. But yes, that data, we do provide that data here.
And then we have a question about kind of more, this research would be kind of more in-depth and less, you know, from publicly available sources, but has there been research quantifying the kind of long-term impact of evictions on folks' record, you know, including, you know, future denial of rental opportunities, particularly with a lens that looks at race and ethnicity? Does that exist,
Yeah.
Finn, or is that work that you want
Alyssa,
to do?
also feel free to jump in. So I kind of see the way this question is being framed, and it's really kind of discussing sort of exactly how I explain kind of the greater impacts of an eviction crisis, right? So the long-term impact of an eviction filing leaves tenants with an eviction record for all eternity, right? Even if the case is settled, quote unquote, favorably, right? Like whatever that looks like, that eviction filing exists forever. And housing providers can access tenants' rental histories, kind of like a credit history. And so then that eviction filing serves as a barrier to all future tenancy, right? Because that tenant now has an eviction record. So when we talk about kind of the long-term impacts and disparities that eviction filings have on race and sex, we're not talking about that as a moment in time. We're talking about that as a continued legacy of discriminatory housing policies that limit the housing opportunities specifically for Black females, and Black females with children, I think, is another phenomena in the data. So that's sort of one way to kind of answer that question on a broader level, that we see the large impacts. There is also some data out of the National Homeless Alliance, National Alliance to End Homelessness, I apologize, I have that acronym wrong, that tracks the outcomes of what happens to families post-eviction, not unlike what Matthew Desmond does in his ethnography. And what was found is that families who face eviction don't necessarily enter homelessness right away. It's a slightly longer process. And so one of the findings was that families who face eviction, it's about 18 months to homelessness. And that's what the national level data is saying. And that's certainly not, we don't have the data on that in Connecticut, although I think that there is enough data collected that we could if we wanted to. So that would be an implication for future research.
And then this might be a good question for Melissa. We have a question: how soon after a payout from Unite CT can a landlord resume eviction proceedings?
So, so if there's an open eviction court case, they must withdraw that court case, so they can't proceed on that case. And then the question is if basically it resets. So let's say that the Unite CT program paid the arrearage off, the eviction case was withdrawn, we're in the next month and the tenant falls behind again, the landlord could then start a new case for this new non-payment. Or if the landlord or if the tenant violated the lease in the next month, they could start an eviction case for that reason. But assuming that the assuming that they don't acquire any additional rental arrearage or don't violate the lease in any other ways in the future, and they still have a rental active lease agreement, then they wouldn't be able to file an eviction case against that tenant. The caveat, and it was mentioned in the chat too, is if the tenant's lease agreement has already expired, then when the case is withdrawn, that tenant is probably entering a month-to-month agreement, which in Connecticut is vulnerable to this no cause eviction filing. So that's one weakness of our protections, where landlords are receiving these payments, but it's not required that they sign a new year lease with the tenant. So it definitely is not ideal.
And Melissa, this question might be for you too. Is there any effort to change policies to automatically expunge eviction records after a period of time?
Yes, definitely there is, for sure. And we definitely support those efforts. In the last legislative session, there was proposed bill that would mask records in a pretty comprehensive way, including while the case is open, which is really important, because sometimes a tenant may end up in a situation where they have a case, nothing has been proven, they haven't gone to trial, there's no judgment against them, but they already have a record, and that record is already showing up to prospective landlords. So they're often stuck where they want to move, maybe they even have the money to move, but now they have this record of this open case. So there is legislation. It wasn't successful last year. It may be reintroduced this session. But in terms of interventions, that is definitely another very important one that we see that Connecticut needs to move forward on.
Great. And we also have some chats. Community Solution is working on, efforts to provide mediation kind of upstream before we get to the point of eviction. So that seems like an important kind of point of intervention in these systems.
I guess I can take that.
Sure.
And happy John to talk more offline. There's definitely a lot of different proposals and pilot programs that have been done with mediation. One thing that I always, and I'm sure you know this, John, but I will share with others, is that mediation can mean a lot of different things. So right now there is something that is called by the courts mediation during an eviction court case, but it's not really a mediation that we would think of in a colloquial sense. It's once a case has already been filed, there's this open record, and the stakes are really different, because you're one step away from a landlord getting a judgment against you and forcing you out. So it's not really a true mediation where you're kind of in a neutral place and you're able to reach a resolution that doesn't involve any kind of eviction or impact of a record. So I think that the potential of creating a mediation program well before anyone gets to filing an eviction case is an interesting one, and sometimes those issues can be mediated out. And so, yeah, I would love to think more about it. There have been some efforts associated with the Unite CT program to do mediation before a case is started, but I firmly believe that once eviction legal papers have been served, it's in the interest of everyone to make sure that tenants are receiving legal representation and advice, because otherwise they can end up agreeing to things that waive a lot of their rights and cause a lot of unnecessary confusion and early moving when they don't need to. So I think it's a combination.
And this might be a question for Melissa or for Finn to kind of wrap up what we're doing, but do we have a sense of kind of how Connecticut compares to the rest of the country in terms of evictions and kind of the issues that we're trying to take on?
Yeah, so the work of Matthew Desmond, who authored Evicted and runs the eviction lab at Princeton University, actually spearheaded the center's investment in looking at eviction as sort of a civil rights issue, right? That's how they did it. And it was a couple of years ago now, they did an analysis of the top 100 evicting cities in the country, and 4 of Connecticut's major metro areas are in the top 75. So this is not an eviction crisis brought upon about the pandemic, and this is not an eviction crisis that is a new phenomenon, right? This has been a long-standing legacy in Connecticut where almost 20,000 families or households annually have evictions filed against them. And that has been persistent for the past 5 years, and that's evident in the data analyzed by C2 data. So we are winning the nation in an eviction crisis, if that is a way to quantify that.
Well, I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I don't see more questions, but I want to thank particularly the state legislators who made time to be on our call this morning, and we would certainly all be happy to serve as references. I know that I, for the first time, submitted testimony last night, and I was very psyched because my senior high school daughter is taking government class, and I could say, hey, I just sent in testimony. So if I can do it, all of you can do it. It makes a huge difference. So please exercise your civic responsibility and participate is, I guess, the message that we'd like to leave you with today. Thank you so much to all of our fabulous panelists and to CT Data for their fabulous work. And thank you to the National Low Income Housing Coalition and to the William and Allison Mortensen Foundation for also providing funding for this really vital work. Please, we put our emails in the chat, but we'll also be sending a follow-up email with all of the links that we've listed, as well as a recording today, which we will be sure and caption. We're sorry that the captions didn't work today on the Zoom. But thank you all so much.